by the news that chemical weapons have been used in the long civil war taking place in Syria, an attack that may have killed as many as 100 people and injured many more. Of course, babies were among those horrifically killed or injured. I only wish the millions of Syrian refugees, including Syrian babies, barred by Trump from entering the United States, could elicit the same crocodile tears that supposedly moved Trump to send those Tomahawk missiles raining down on Syria. It made me think of the picture of that naked young Vietnamese girl running down the road with others shrieking in pain after a napalm attack by the U.S. military during our war against the people of Vietnam. It made me think of the Vietnamese and American GIs who suffered the effects of the U.S. military's use of the chemical Agent Orange during that same war. And it made me think of the fragmentation bombs the United States dropped on the people of Vietnam, a bomb that by design is not intended to destroy buildings or military equipment, but intended only to destroy human beings. And it also made me think of the U.S. bombing currently underway in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and Syria, and I'm probably missing a few places, and the so-called collateral damage resulting from our now basically unregulated use of drones, resulting in who knows exactly how many hundreds and hundreds of civilian deaths and injuries, since our government continually lies about the numbers of civilians it kills. So I ask myself, where is the outrage over what this country is doing in oh so many countries, countries whose governments are not waging war on us? Yes, the use of chemical weapons in Syria or in Vietnam should be vigorously condemned. Those responsible should be held accountable for their war crimes. Certainly those responsible for the long list of U.S. war crimes over the years and continuing to this day should be held accountable. And yet, I have absolutely no reason to believe that U.S. war crimes will end soon, if ever, or that the criminals committing them now or in the past will ever be brought to justice. And where, I ask, is the Western world's outrage over this damning and unforgivable fact? Well, Syria, that's our topic today. Is there any geopolitical crisis in the world today any more complex and contradictory than Syria? The United States has been both an ally and an adversary of Syria's Assad, changing sides depending on what the U.S. sees as its best interest. Syria, for example, was our ally in the Persian Gulf War. And now that Assad is not an ally, who can really say what the foreign policy position of the United States is vis-a-vis Syria? One minute Trump is talking as though the bombing by those Tomahawk missiles was just the beginning. The next he says we have no intentions of a wider war and so forth. Secretary of State Tillerson, same thing. But while Tillerson's talking about the Tomahawks maybe as a one-off, well, there's Ambassador Haley at the UN who was suggesting it was only the opening volley. Maybe it's because Syria is an example of a situation that's so complicated, to put it highly stiffing terms, so screwed up politically. Certainly Russia has not turned its back on Syria. Certainly the so-called rebel opposition has not stopped fighting to throw out Assad, nor has ISIS. And one of the course ironies of Trump's missile attack was that it served mainly to help ISIS, who Trump says is the main reason we're fighting in Syria. That is to defeat ISIS and not to get rid of Assad. Makes your head spin. Well, friends, if you stay tuned, I promise you that by the end of our show today, you'll finally have a decent understanding of what the Syrian civil war is all about. A war now in its 7th year, a war that has displaced inside and outside of the country at least 11 million Syrians, killed at least 500,000 Syrians. You'll understand what the various players in the civil war want and how they're going about getting it, and you'll be in a good place to form your own opinion and have an opinion about what the U.S. should be doing, if anything, by way of involvement in Syria's civil war. Why? Because we've got some good guests today who know of which they speak. Johnny Achi is a Syrian-born American who has visited Syria at least 30 times or so. 6 of those in recent years. He's led several peace delegations in recent years to Syria. He's also the co-founder of Arab Americans for Syrians. Richard Becker, who's been a guest in our show a number of times, is the West Coast coordinator of the Answer Anti-War and Anti-Racism Coalition, which has already organized protests against Trump's bombing of Syria last week. And, of course, it was Answer that organized that huge counter-inaugural march in Washington on January 20th. And Mr. Becker is also a leading member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and writes frequently for their publications. And a warm welcome to the Lawyers Guild show to both of you gentlemen. Richard Becker, let's start by giving our audience a brief history of Syria over, say, the last 30 years or so, but from the perspective during that time, especially of the changing U.S. relationship with Syria's President Assad.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Jim. And I would say if you go back even a little bit further than that, the very first coup ever attempted by the Central Intelligence Agency wasn't the early one that it's best known for, which was against the Mossadegh government in Iran, but it was in 1940, which was 1953. It was 1949, and it was in Syria. Mm-hmm. So as you said, the relations between the United States and Syria have gone through different manifestations, different iterations, but in general, aside from particular periods of cooperation, the general idea has been to overthrow the government and to reduce Syria to the status of being a neo-colony. It's very interesting. The first time I ever traveled to Syria was in July of 1986, and I just saw a document that was an interagency document, a lengthy document, dated July 30th, 1986, and this just came to my attention in the last week, which was a big discussion among all these different agencies of the government of what the prospects were for overthrowing the government that was headed at the time by Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president, and also who was also leader of the Ba'ath Socialist Party, Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party. And so we've seen this, and then the only other time I was in Syria was in for a conference, and it was in December of 2005. And I got there in the middle of the night, and then when I woke up the next morning, a politician in Lebanon, a conservative politician in Lebanon, had been killed. Earlier that year, a much more prominent politician, who the former Prime Minister, Rafik Hariri, had been assassinated also. And as soon as, the day that the second assassination happened was the day before the United Nations was supposed to come out with a report that was expected to blame Syria for the earlier assassination. But that didn't stop Condoleezza Rice from immediately going on TV and announcing within hours after the second assassination that it was in fact Syria who was responsible. Now, how she would know that, she didn't know, of course. This is wishful thinking. But the reason I mention it is because it showed that at that time, too, the United States was seeking the overthrow of the government. And I think that that they've made it very clear, despite the earlier statements by Trump and some of his advisors, that is the aim again, that is what's back on the table. The mantra of Assad must go is back on the table. So we can see, and if you look at Syria, and I'll just say this, Syria is so central to the whole region. It borders Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq and Israel. It's right in the center of the Middle East, which you can see why when the planners in the Pentagon and the White House think about this strategy of global domination and domination of the Middle East, that's an objective of theirs.
Johnny Achi, same question, but with respect to Russia, how would you describe Russia's relationship over the years and currently with regard to the Assad government or with regard to Syria in general?
Firstly, thank you, Jim, for having me on the show. It's been a while. We've said it repeatedly, Russia's position in Syria is an ally of Syria, not an enemy of the country. I've been an ally of Syria since the 1950s, actually. We know that Syria belongs to the Eastern Bloc. That's not a secret. The Western regions and Western powers decided to be on the side of Israel against the Palestinian people and against the Arab struggles. Syria is an Arab national state that called for the Arab unification to stop the Israeli aggression against different populations. We know the expansionist policy of Israel will never end if there was no resistances. Syria is a proud sponsor, yes, of the Palestinian resistance in South Lebanon. They do help the Hamas and different Palestinian resistances back in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s throughout. But we do call for a just peace. We're not an aggressive nation. We stand on the side of the oppressed. And that is God's given right to humanity to stop against an aggression of an expansionist policy. Someone's coming into your home, you have to defend yourself. So yes, Syria has been on the side of the oppressed in Syria and Lebanon. Call for a just peace for all Palestinians. When we do have a Palestinian state, Syria would be the first one on the table to shake hands and say and call it. Let's have peace at the home at least. Now Syria's position, that one position that Syria has taken for the last 60, 70 years, is why Syria is being destroyed today the way it's been destroyed. We believe what is happening to Syria is a war on Syria. It is not a civil war, and I've said this many, many times on many, many shows. I've been to Syria many times in the conflict, actually, in the last 6 years, more than I've ever been in the 30 years I've been in the States. 8 times in the last 6 years. I can assure you, Jim, there is no civil war in Syria. You can go to Damascus, where more than 5 million people live, and you will see most ethnicities exist in Damascus. It's a mosaic of all different types. Background, ethnicity background, religious background, sectarian backgrounds. And no one is carrying a knife or a sword trying to chop anybody else's head. On the contrary, we have each other backs against the invaders. You look at any city in Syria, it's protected by its own people, all different sects. But what happens
But before we get lost in that point, and we've got a whole hour here, so it's okay. But before we get lost on that point, if I heard you right, you're saying there's no civil war in Syria because there are no Syrians fighting to get rid of the Assad government. Is that your position?
Absolutely. A civil war meaning two sects of Syrians fighting each other.
No, I understand what a civil war means, but we've certainly in the Western press, which I'm always skeptical of course, but certainly in the Western press, we hear about rebels. We understand the rebels are infiltrated by all sorts of folks, but I think if certainly if you did a poll of the American people, they would see it as a civil war because brainwashed or otherwise, they've come to believe that in point of fact, there are Syrian people who do not like Assad. The Western press, of course, has painted Assad as an autocratic ruler who does not hesitate to, in this case, use chemical weapons. We'll get to that in a minute. And those who are fighting him rather than ISIS, they claim, are rank-and-file Syrians who simply want to live in a free and democratic country. I hear you saying that's not. Dick Becker, same question to you. Do you agree that there really there's no civil war going on in Syria? Dick, are you still there?
Well, I have not been there. I mean, I believe that Johnny is a very good source, far more knowledgeable source about what's going on the ground in Syria than I am. I think that there have been some Syrians who are involved in it, but clearly it's become a proxy war. And what the United States is doing there, what Britain and France, Jordan, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others are doing there is, working to bring about the destruction of the country. And, it really is it's an unbelievable tragedy what has happened to Syria. And that I don't think is appreciated enough. It's sometimes brought up, that there's been great destruction and hundreds of thousands of people killed and so forth. That's brought up, but it's only brought up in the U.S. corporate media to use as an accusation.
Yes.
To use for propaganda purposes against the government. I mean, the last time I was there, and I've only been there a couple of times, but I was struck by the fact that Syria was really different. You weren't going, there were no McDonald's, there was no Kentucky Fried Chicken, and maybe that was the greatest sin of all in terms of the eyes of the West.
Yes, probably so.
That they hadn't opened up in that kind of way, but I mean, if you had seen Syria then, when I think about Syria now and what has been done to it, that anyone who would do that, and there's no possibility that we would be, in, what is this 7th year?
Seventh year.
We're in the 7th year now of this. There's no way that this could have gone on without the intervention of those who are trying to bring about regime change, who are trying to remove the government and replace it with a different kind of government, who have poured billions, tens of billions of dollars of all kinds of weaponry and funding and everything to support the war, what really is essentially a war against the government. The narrative that we are given here in the mainstream media, in the corporate media, is the whole people, the people against the government. And as Johnny has said, that's just a ridiculous notion, a totally ridiculous notion, and that it's very clear that the great majority of people in Syria now want an end to this, and they don't want to be ruled by the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, or ISIS, or many of the other organizations which are very similar in their outlook, but have, regional bases. That's not Syria. That really has not been Syria, and I don't think the Syrian people want anything like that for their future.
All right. Gianni Achi, let's follow up on that, because the other question I was sort of putting to, I guess, implicitly when you talked about the fact this really isn't a civil war. There may be some Syrians, fighting against Assad, but that's not really what this is all about. Going back again to the picture we get in this country, this picture from the Western press and our politicians here that President Assad is an autocratic ruler who, as I say, doesn't hesitate to, slaughter his own people and all of that. No democracy, blah, blah, blah. How is that an accurate picture? How would you describe governance in Syria today? How would you describe the situation with the Syrian people in terms of what they have a right to do and not to do and so forth? How would you characterize governance?
Excellent question. Jim, just to finish the previous message, I don't want to be misunderstood. Yes, absolutely, there's an absolute political opposition to the Assad regime. No one is saying no. I sat with many oppositions, political opposition. We're not talking about terrorist fighters on the ground. What I'm trying to say, if it wasn't, the Syrian people are not fueling the war. The Syrian people are not going after each other's neck.
Gotcha.
Syrian people just met in Astana and Geneva, and they want to end this. And they have all sat down and put the weapons down. It's the other that what answer just said. I'm sorry, Richard.
Richard Becker.
The proxy war. Richard. The proxy war is the enemies of Syria who are benefiting from this war cannot see it end. And that's what will come later to that point of that chemical attack. But back to the Syrian government. Syria enjoy relative democracy. I am not saying democracy as the West would. We have different outlook to democracy. Democracy in Syria is security, is peace, is calm. That is to a lot of Syrians. Syria is a republic. It has a parliamentary election since the 40s. Syria has voted more women to the Syrian parliament than all other Arab countries combined since the 40s. We are all equal under the law. No one knows who's Muslim, who's Christian. It's a secular government. For those people who are calling for or say that the Syrian is an autocracy, it's ridiculous. It's what the alternative is meant to be, is an autocracy, is a religious theocracy, is what they want to replace this secular regime. And that's another reason why Syria is being fought, because of its secular composition in the Middle East that's constituted of monarchies and Islamic regimes. You cannot have such a beautiful secular government. There is no, the views that have been said about no democracy and about civil war. These words, these phrases about fetid rebels, moderate rebels, are just made-up words. If you go live in Syria, you understand that the absolute opposite is the truth.
All right. And by the way, I've done shows here on the Lawyers Guild show about it. We've done some interesting shows here on the Lawyers Guild show about how much of a democracy is the United States of America in any real sense. Dick Becker, back to you for a minute. What would you say is the aim of the U.S.? Why does the U.S. want to get rid of Assad? Why does it want to, in a sense, control what happens in Syria? Is it simply a matter of its strategic position, oil again? How would you describe it?
Well, I think that it has evolved somewhat. And evolved in a worse direction now. I mean, that you hear the leading figures in the Trump administration saying, that there can be no future with Assad now. I mean, they've kind of done this big change, but I think this is reminiscent of what happened. But Syria is part of a bigger picture here, of course. And the bigger picture is that the Trump administration, and Trump is all for this, despite his earlier things about, he was against intervention. Well, that's all in the past. They're taking something from the Reagan playbook, I would say. Reagan came in 1981, and there was a big struggle in the U.S., at the top in the U.S., in the ruling elite, and the ruling class, over whether the U.S. should accept a diminished position in the world following a whole series of revolutions and its defeat in Vietnam and Indochina and so forth, or whether it should go in the direction of rearming and going on the offensive and regaining its position as the dominant power in the world. Mm-hmm. And it was that position that Reagan represented. It was that position which went out. And we saw at that time an enormous military buildup. Trump is proposing a big military buildup, and a very assertive policy intervention in Central America, extreme hostility toward the Soviet Union, which existed at that time. And, with the fall of the Soviet Union, they kind of achieved their aim. Now we see that there's been a period that since 2003 in the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. position in the world has again been diminished, and other countries have come forward and developed and so forth. So the question has again arisen: will the United States accept, the United States leaders accept a diminished position rather than being the hegemonic world empire? And I think that the Trump administration is reminiscent of the Reagan administration in that respect, and you can see their extreme belligerence in regard to Syria, and now their extreme belligerence, and perhaps even more so in regard to Korea. But they are on the move, and so Syria, of course, as I said before, has and as I think anyone who looks at the map can see, has a key strategic position. But this is also great contention with Russia, contention with China, trying to push them back and assert that it is the United States which will once again be the determining force. Whether or not they can do that is another question. But I don't think there's much question at this point about that's what the Trump administration is trying to do.
All right. And Johnny, Achi, going back to this question again of what we learn, putting quotes around learn from the Western press again. The Western press is satisfied. The New York Times had new reports out today supposedly documenting the indisputable fact now that, in fact, those chemical weapons were used on people in Syria by the Assad regime. Do we really know who caused those chemical weapons to be used? Was it really a deliberate act by the Assad forces or some other group? Could it have been the Assad Air Force accidentally bombing a storage building where ISIS, Nasra Front or somebody was storing chemical weapons? And I ask that in part because I'm looking here at a report that's just come out, and you probably have heard of this. Philip Giraldi, a former CIA officer and director of the Council for the National Interest, he stated just, I think it was yesterday or the day before on the Scott Horton show, that military and intelligence personnel in the Middle East who are intimately familiar with the intelligence say the allegation that Assad or Russia carried out the attack is a sham. Johnny Achi, what can you tell us about that?
Okay. I never claim that I know for sure. Mm-hmm. This is what we need to all just take a minute before we act irrational to try. And so here's what happened. But things were reasonably going great for the Syrian government and the Syrian army. Let's just stand a step away, as we don't take any side on this. Let's just look who is the beneficiary of such a criminal act. Mm-hmm. Syria was winning the war on all fronts in Syria. Al-Qaeda was defeated to the last place. It's in the northern eastern part, and Al-Raqqa, where ISIS is. Those are the only two last provinces where ISIS and Al-Qaeda controlled territories. Syria was winning all inside of Syria, making peace with a lot of groups, turning their weapons in. Everything is going great. Secondly, world leaders started saying now we can live with Assad. It's not our job anymore to determine. Secretary of State Rick Tillerson just made that remark only a week earlier when he said no longer will the U.S. determine the fate of Bashar Assad. This will be left to the Syrian people. Great. Peace talks are going excellent, as far as they can go. A lot of these groups put their weapons down, signed the peace agreement. What's left is who's left on the ground? ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Nusra. Those are the three extremist radicals who refuse to take place. When everything is going wrong for this Al-Qaeda and everything is going right for Bashar al-Assad and his army, suddenly we decided to go up in the sky, release some chemical sarin attack to kill 70 people. How is that militarily or strategically make any sense to a government who has survived 6 years of a proxy war, survived the war of invasion of over 100,000 mercenaries from all over the world, and now that we are winning? We know about red lines. We've never crossed it back in 2013, and it was proven, Jim. Let's go back to 2013. It was proven by United Nations observers after they did all the investigations that it was most likely the oppositions or the terrorist groups who have released that gas in Eastern Ghouta, and before it in Khan al-Asal. We've asked for the United Nations to come into Syria on the eve of the 21st of August. On the 20th, they arrived. The 21st, we have another chemical attack back in 2013. And if there was evidence, if there was one shred of evidence, Obama would have carried out with the war on Syria. But on the contrary, he canceled the vote in the Congress, just like the House of Commons in England voted it down because all the evidence showed that the terrorists on the ground. Rewind now or forward 4 years later, these same terrorists, seeing that the end is near, they figured that we have a new guy in power, and the U.S. administration, who's losing his ratings, is being demolished by his own party, let alone the Democrats. He probably needs to be perceived as a decisive. Let's just do this again one more time. It's another pretext for intervention. Mm-hmm. I don't know what happened. Honestly, there's a lot of theories, but they're theories. There's one that, yes, the U.S. was informed that there was going to be a bombing of that one particular place because the Russians, as you know, and the Americans have a dedicated phone line.
Yes.
It's being used for the last almost 2 months to coordinate and to prevent the U.S. and Russian air assets from shooting at each other. So there was an indication that, yes, we have an explosive depot for the Islamic rebel in the ground that the Syrian army is going to go up, or the Russian army, we don't know who did it, but a bomb. Conventional arms. Why would we need to use chemicals when we have conventional weapons? We are not at the end. Here's someone who is desperate will act such an act. And the Syrian government has never been desperate. From day one, they said, we don't use it. Yes, we did have it. We turned it in. And by the way, as early as this past January, there was a report that the Syrian army have, over 2 years ago, done. We destroyed all the chemical weapons with all 100%. So we know there is no stockpile. But one last point, very important, Jim. We know that the rebels have a huge stockpile of chemical weapons. It was discovered in eastern Aleppo after the Syrian army liberated eastern Aleppo, reported by Westerners. There was pictures of hidden a stockpile of chemical barrels in schools of all places. These terror organizations will not hesitate, will not shy away to use this in order to implicate the Syrian government. There's no compulsion for the Syrian government to use chemicals weapon or chemicals warfare. A chemicals bomb would have taken a whole city out, not killed 70.
Right.
There's some fume that was released from some barrel who have affected these people. Let's just be rational. Before we act, before we go and commit a stupid, illegal act against a sovereign nation, based on feeling.
Yes.
That's what we need just to take a minute.
Well, I we're going to have to take a station break here in a minute, but I just wanted to say, because it's relevant to your point, former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter has pointed out that chemical attacks have occurred in Syria on a regular basis, that some were attributed to the Syrian government, but the government denied them, and that the majority of those attacks, though, were attributed to the anti-regime fighters, in particular those affiliated with Al-Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. All right, this is KPFK. It's 90.7 FM here in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara County, 93.7 in San Diego, and 99.5 in Ridgecrest and in China Lake. We stream worldwide at kpfk.org. You're listening to the Lawyers Guild Show. I'm Jim Lafferty, and we're talking about Syria. Are we on the brink of a much wider war of intervention in Syria? My guests are two people who have studied this question closely. In the case of one guest, Johnny Achi, he is Syrian-born. He's a Syrian-born American who has visited Syria 30 or 40 times or more, and 8 times in the last number of years. He's led peace delegations to Syria. He's also the co-founder of Arab Americans for Syria. Also on our show today is Dick Becker. Dick Becker is the West Coast coordinator for the Answer Anti-War and Anti-Racism Coalition. He's a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And indeed, Answer has already been in the streets protesting Trump's sending of those Tomahawk missiles. All right. The question of why the war has gone on so long, I think. Again, if you talk to people who aren't well informed, and I think those of us in the West are not, you'll get answers like, gee, I don't understand. I thought the Syrian army and the Air Force were pretty big and powerful, and what's going on? It's into its 7th year and it hasn't been able to crush these little bands of terrorists, quote unquote, and the U.S. and Russia, but I thought Russia's helping the Syrian government and the U.S. is. So what would you say? What would you say, Johnny Achi, and then we get Dick's opinion on this? There is the reason why the war is still going on. You've said that it now seems to be at a perhaps turning point where the Syrian government is pushing back the opposition. But why so long? We're in our 7th year.
Excellent point, Jim. Back in 2014, when things started to go well again for the Syrian government, we survived the first offensive from when the borders were opened from Turkey, and hundreds of, literally over 100,000 mercenaries coming from all over the world, from 80 different countries, trying to fight what they call a jihad war against the infidels in Syria. I'm an infidel, you're an infidel, every Syrian is an infidel. Anyone who does not believe in this ideology of takfiri, you're an infidel. Yeah. So as we're starting to win this war, then the United States used ISIS as a pretext to intervention in Syria. They've tried different pretexts, humanitarian corridors, they did that, chemical attacks. 2013 failed. All those massacres that was done by the rebels, called or accused to the Syrian government, all failed. So now we use ISIS. So now they created a coalition without the approval of the Syrian government, mind you, decided we want to fight ISIS over Syrian airspace. So here we go, made 60 countries, and some of these countries, funny enough, are Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, some of the same countries who have been funneling billions of dollars into the hand of terrorists, and that's no longer a secret. It's all over. They have admitted it. They're sending weapons and artilleries to these fanatics. Now, these fanatics become suddenly ISIS, and they want to fight them. So for a whole year, from 2014 almost to September 2015, United States government and 60 other countries fighting, like you just said, band of some nomads running around desert with some armored vehicles, maybe 70, maybe 100,000 of them. 1 year later, all we heard that ISIS is growing its territory, and that's exactly what the Syrian civilization has suffered. More towns were terrorized by ISIS, more towns were destroyed by ISIS, and more weapons was given to ISIS. More mistakes made by the United States, and they apologized a few times by bombing Syrian infrastructure, buying Syrian army bases. So in September 30th, 2015, the whole world could see, Syria could see what's going on, requested the help of Russia, again an ally of Syria. Russia only entered the war against ISIS in September 30th. Within a month, Russia made America and these other 60 countries look ridiculous. In less than a month, almost 40% of the infrastructure of ISIS was destroyed. All those oil tankers that were stealing, robbing from Syria up to Turkey was destroyed, and the real war against ISIS was started. From that point on, that's when the Syrian army got its strength back. On the ground is the Syrian army who's fighting the fight. We liberated one town after another to the final amazing liberation of Aleppo in December of 2016, just a few months ago. Liberated Aleppans came out from eastern Aleppo. No one interviewed these. I was wondering what happened to the Western report about what was going on in Aleppo and how they were suffering on the hand of the Syrian army. Go interview these people, what they've been through for 4 years under the occupation of ISIS. These people were liberated. Syria has won the war with the help of Russia, yes. and ISIS is finally coming to an end, is being defeated. Mm-hmm. That is what is happening. Now, today, we see again another pretext trying to tip things over. We cannot, after all these billions we spend, all this money we spend, we still could not have achieved our goal, a regime change in Damascus. That is what the United States government and the colonial powers are after, regime change, and it didn't happen, and they're trying to boost the world again into another false flag operation like just happened.
Yeah. Dick, following up on what Johnny Achi has just said, it suggests that once the war turned, once it appeared that, in fact, all of these hundreds of thousands of foreign fighters and ISIS and what have you weren't going to, and Russia got into it, weren't going to be sufficient to get rid of Assad or force him into some kind of coalition government or force him to leave. The United States who's been bombing right along, was looking for an opportunity to take more definitive action, and that may explain what happened last week. Is that your assessment? If not, why do you think, was it really the chemical attack, whoever was behind it, that gave Trump the excuse? Was he just looking for an excuse? Talk to us about the timing of that, and because that leads into where we think the U.S. is going to be going next with respect to Syria.
Well, obviously there was a decision made to change again the policy here, or to move in a somewhat different direction. And the level of hypocrisy in this is just beyond belief. It defies belief, I would say. That is that, there's certain kinds of propaganda, there's certain words that are said that are meant to inflame public opinion in the United States. Barrel bombs is one of them.
Yes.
Barrel bombs are bad. Apparently 500-pound bombs that are dropped by U.S.-provided Saudi fighter bombers on the people in Yemen and Syria, that's not bad.
No.
We never hear about that. I went online and I tried to find photos of the victims of the U.S. bombing when they killed over 200 people in one bombing in Mosul.
Yep.
I looked for Yemen, for photos of Yemen. You can hardly find anything about this, but you could find, it was just unlimited amounts of images that came forward. And I have to say, a lot of this is very carefully prepared and very carefully planned. Hill and Knowlton, which is a PR agency that specializes in this, they were the ones who, for people who remember back that far in 1990, they were the ones who promoted the incubator story about how the Iraqi soldiers are coming to the hospital in Kuwait and throwing the babies on the floor, and they want to take the incubators back to Iraq. And they have a saying. Hill and Knowlton has a saying, and the saying is that first impressions are everything. Mm-hmm. Whatever happens afterwards just doesn't really matter to us in terms of creating public opinion. So we can see that there's been a deliberate campaign, and as Johnny said earlier, when a rich uncle dies, the investigators ask cui bono, the Latin word for who is the beneficiary. Mm-hmm. And, who is the beneficiary? Who could possibly be? And I just emphasize reinforce what Johnny said about that. How could that possibly have been something that the Syrian government would want to undertake? That's not conceivable. We don't know the details of what happened, but we do know that that was not something that the government was about to do, particularly at this juncture. But the fact that the U.S. government could make a decision now to launch a military attack, it should point out that they launched the military attack exactly while Trump was having dinner with the leader of China, Xi Jinping. And so it had a beneficial, from their point of view, beneficial effect of, we could send a message to China and also a message to Syria, and also then announce that that accepting of the idea that the present government in Syria can continue, that's off, it has to go. Mm-hmm. So I would say I think this is very much connected to the global strategy, the global hegemonic strategy, the strategy of global domination that the the U.S. government, the Trump administration is embracing.
Well, and in terms of public opinion, a poll yesterday or the day before suggested that 60% of Americans supported Trump's bombing in Syria. Whether that will have any lasting effect or not, I haven't seen a poll as to what it's exactly done to his own personal approval rating, which was hovering between 35 and 40%. But one has to wonder if that wasn't in the calculation as well. Certainly the hypocrisy of Trump crying those crocodile tears over those poor babies. He doesn't give a damn about the refugees that he's barred from this country, many of them babies. So you can't take that at anything other than a contrivance. Certainly this wouldn't be the first time with respect to the so-called chemical used by the Syrian government. We got into the Iraq war lying about weapons of mass destruction and so forth. But I guess... go ahead, Dick.
Can I just say, Jim?
Yeah, please.
And if he's so concerned about children, why is he trying to take health care away from millions of children here?
To say nothing about maternity care.
Really, and also I have to say that one of the remarkable things about it, and I guess it's not really that remarkable, but the support from the Democrats for Trump and for the attack was just overwhelming to such an extent that the one prominent Democrat who really opposed it, some of them said, well, he should come to Congress, but Bernie Sanders himself endorsed the idea that this was done by the Syrian government. He doesn't know either. Yeah. But he decided to say so. But Tulsi Gabbard, who is a congresswoman from Hawaii, who served two deployments in Iraq, she's still, I think, a military officer, actually, but has had the nerve to go to Syria in January and meet with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, and then to question what's really going on here. The fact that she said there should be an investigation before we find somebody guilty, that caused Howard Dean and other leading Democrats to write a letter to the people of her congressional district in Hawaii, the 2nd Congressional District, and urge them to vote her out of office the next time because she had the nerve to say that. Yeah, isn't that amazing? Yeah, well, when it comes to foreign policy, the Democrats and Republicans have never really at core been that far apart. One last station ID, this is KPFK. It's 90.7 FM here in Los Angeles, 98.7 in Santa Barbara County, 93.7 in San Diego, 99.5 in China Lake and Ridgecrest, streaming worldwide on the web, kpfk.org. And they are Johnny Achi, who is the founder of Arab Americans for Syria, traveled to Syria. He's a Syrian-born gentleman. He's been back to Syria dozens and dozens of times. He's led peace delegations back there and so forth. And Dick Becker, West Coast coordinator of the Answer Coalition, which has already been in the streets protesting what Trump did. But I guess my question still remains, Johnny, Dick, while you're thinking about it too, Johnny, though, what is your guess? I mean, this has been so crazy. Every day the administration changes its view on what it's going to do. So I suppose I'm asking the impossible, but what is your sense, or your fear, or your sense of what the Trump administration will likely do? Is this a one-off, or should we expect to see now more bombings, more active military action on the part of the United States government to get rid of Assad?
It is, if Trump listens to the war drums of John McCain, the Lindsey Graham, and the Marco Rubios, and order Syria's airports destroyed like he said he might, then we would be at war not only in Syria against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but with, of course, Syria, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and we're looking at World War III, no doubt. The question is, the point is, I want to talk what Dick just mentioned about children. And let's talk about the victims here for a minute. We need to stop and listen to ourselves. America does not care about Syrian civilians or children. And I'm not mean by American, you know what I mean? I mean the establishment, of course, Americans, we are all Americans, and we understand how compassionate we are toward other nations, but we just don't read anymore. We just listen to the fake news that we are being fed with every day. But America and the colonial powers and the Gulf states and their media are frothing at the mouth today over this last the escalation. However, they do whitewash their crimes of the moderates, of the rebels. There are crimes in Syria since 6-7 years ago that has no one seen. as early, Jim, as June 11th or June 6th, 2011. Not even 2 weeks or 1 month into the crisis in Syria, there was the biggest massacre committed against 118 security forces in a place in Idlib, out of all places. The Shaur massacre. And Robert Ford, the U.S. ambassador to Syria at the time, was there. Never reported. BBC were there, CNN was there. 118 men massacred way back in the early of this fight. But the point is we're trying to make, let's just report the truth. If the truth can set us free, we should kneel. You cannot consider all these terrorists as moderate rebels and support them. I want to tell you, this gas attack, is an atrocity. Yes. It's a war crime. Yes. And the pictures of tiny victims are heart-rending. But there are 400,000 people who have died in Syria's conflict. Many of them, thousands of them, are children and infants. And both sides. And you have to understand, were they killed by Assad? If this is what we want to lead the world to believe, then we're never going to be over. Assad is battling insurgents and jihadists who would slaughter the Syrian population. He's a defender of a nation. When the United States and all the enemies of Syria tell me you need to get rid of this guy, then I know I need to hold on to him. We have to hold on to him because just like what happened to those Copts were massacred in Egypt on Palm Sunday.
Yes.
How is Assad more responsible to the death of the Syrian than those terrorist groups, those psychopaths who have filmed themselves burning people alive, chopping heads? Why can't we point our finger to these? Why is everything in the Syrian army and Syrian government who have the responsibility to defend the nation and stand and defend the cities? This is the point that we really need to concentrate on to really see the truth.
But Dick, I couldn't agree with you more, and it's becoming more and more difficult if all one reads is the Western press. Dick, but back to my question again about what's likely to happen next. I know, as I say, it's perhaps a fool's game to try to predict it, and yet maybe not, given what we know to be the U.S. interest in the region. It wouldn't seem shocking to me if they used the excuse of what happened last week to widen the war considerably, in the hopes that then they would that would lead to an escalation on all sides, which would allow us to get in a bigger way. But what do you surmise may be next, Dick? Whoop, Dick.
I think what makes that difficult to answer, Jim, is actually.
Yeah, I know.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now. Yeah, I'm just wondering though,
okay,
what may determine what we do next, for example. Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we face a potentially very serious crisis in Korea.
Yes.
And the United States is moving the another aircraft carrier group there in the midst of the war games that are going on, so-called games, if that develops into a war, then that will become, I think, the riveting focus. It won't mean that they're ignoring Syria or the Middle East or anything, but I don't think the United States is prepared for two wars at the same time.
Right.
But they already are in Syria. They're carrying out airstrikes in Syria. They have troops in Syria. They have special operations forces in Syria. And I think that it's becoming quite clear that the extreme belligerence of the U.S. government, I mean, Tillerson's trip to Russia, which is mostly focused on Syria, but perhaps also somewhat on Korea, the warnings that the different United States officials are issuing, all of these things, we have to take them seriously because they are the leading military power in the world. So I think it's hard to say. I mean, I think that it seems to me that if the Korea crisis pulled back, and I don't feel at all confident that it's going to, then Syria can come more into focus for them in Washington and the Pentagon. But I think it's quite clear now already. It's quite clear that despite the so-called America First rhetoric of the Trump campaign, which was reminiscent of the America First movement before World War II, that was it had a little pro-Nazi elements in it, but that the idea that what he was talking about was the U.S. pulling back on the world stage, that's just the purest of fantasy.
Yeah.
The U.S. is the dominant global empire, 800 bases around the world. No, Russia all talking about Russia and its belligerence. Russia, I believe, has one foreign military base, and it's Tartus, the naval base on the Mediterranean in Syria. That's it. I don't think they have another one. And you would have the impression, though, by the media here that, they're the ones who are all over the world. Yeah. They and the Iranians and, North Korea, and they're the threatening peace all over the world. And, it's reality turned upside down. But it's effective propaganda to a large degree for people in the United States. Not everybody buys it, of course, and I think less and less people will buy it when they see that the cost of a new military buildup will be horrendous in terms of the lives of the lives of the average person in the United States, including many of those who voted for Donald Trump.
All right. Let me a couple of quick announcements. First of all, coming up next, of course, is Bradcast with Brad Friedman. He's going to have news on yesterday's special election in Kansas and much more. Also, in keeping with our show on Syria, you can learn a lot more about this and a lot more about how the Western press manipulates this if you show up at the Peace Center on 3916 Sepulveda Boulevard in Culver City. Why? Well, because Eyewitness Syria program is taking place with Rania Kalek. She is a journalist, political commentator, co-host of the weekly podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. She's known for her reporting on U.S. foreign policy in Israel and Palestine, and of course, a lot of her publications now won't take her reports on what's going on in Syria, but you can hear what's going on in Syria from this award-winning journalist, really. That's tomorrow night. That's tonight. That's tonight, Wednesday night, April 12th, from 7:30 to 10. Get there at 7:30 is my suggestion. It's 3916 Sepulveda Boulevard. That's just south of Venice Boulevard. Lots of parking in the back. It's free, and it's an important evening tonight with Rania. Also, let me ask you this, Johnny Achi. We probably should have gotten into it earlier in the show, but we got caught up in some other important questions. Oh, and by the way, pursuant to what Dick Becker just said, next week our show is going to be about North Korea. I share Dick's thought that is, in fact, the most dangerous place in the world right now, and for the world, not because of necessarily what the North Koreans are doing, but because of what we're likely to do. And so that's our show next week. But Johnny Achi, one of the things we haven't talked about tonight, and it's been going on for almost 70 years. We know about the 11 million people, 5 million displaced within the country, 6 million out. People wandering the world, refugees, none of which we want to let in this country, of course, despite all our caring for those kids. How is Syria surviving? I mean, the country is, other than Damascus, much of it has been laid in ruin. You began to hint at this before, that the Syrian people are apparently pretty remarkable, but they're suffering so greatly. How are they hanging on? And lastly, do we need more street protests? You and I were at one that Answer sponsored last week. Talk to us a bit about all of that.
Syrians are survivors, Jim. It's amazing. When I call and I keep thinking, I'm gonna hear them screaming, crying. They didn't even know there was an attack in the middle of the night in Homs, outside Homs. And they told me, Johnny, don't worry about it. You're always overreacting. They're living as good as anyone can live under the circumstances. We here picture the war as the whole country is ravaged. Absolutely not the case. 10 of the provinces are living very calm, going to school, going to work. People are getting paid. Everybody is in his job. Economic sanctions is the problem. Economically, people are struggling, really suffering, and they need to have this come to an end. The displaced are mostly displaced within Syria. Really, all moved from terrorist-controlled areas to government-controlled areas. We need to stop this before it escalates into a real crisis, into real humanitarian crisis. There is still a chance, Jim. I need to finally with something very important. The Syrian elections that took place in 2014, and I took a delegation to Syria. We went there. There was a lot of international observers, and that's a good point to see. The international observers came back from Syria in June 2014. We went to the UN to report back, and believe it, out of all times, webcast feed was cut off.
Oh, dear.
They would never, ever.
And Johnny, I'm interrupting only because we're going to get cut off in a minute or two. Okay. Not cut off, but we're going to have to move on to the next show. I want to remind our listeners, you can go to Arab Americans for Syria, right, Johnny? The website, Arab Americans for Syria. Yeah. AA4Syria. It's very easy. Or go to certainly answer.org. To find out what Answer is going to be up to, because I can tell you there are going to be more protests about this, certainly if anything escalates in Syria, as it might. And make sure you tune in next week when we're going to talk about perhaps an even more critical situation in terms of danger of world war, certainly as dangerous, and that is the situation with North Korea and the United States claiming it will not allow it to have what the United States has, and that is bombs that are nuclear. Thank you, though, to Johnny Achi and to Dick Becker. Thank you both, fellas, for joining me today here on the Lawyers Guild Show. Appreciate it. Thanks always to Allison Cooper and to Lori Trackman. Thanks to D'Angelo Jones and Master Control. This is